Hello, everyone. There was some issues with the audio file being corrupted for the last live lecture recording, so I re-recorded the presentation here. I'll see you all next week. Project planning decisions shape how value is defined, delivered, and governed. This week, we focus on how planning decisions directly influence the delivery of value. We begin by reinforcing lifecycle tailoring as a deliberate planning choice, then examine how stakeholder engagement and how sourcing strategies support governance and value alignment. From there, we move on to scope planning, requirement solicitation, and finally the development of the scope structure, including the work breakdown structure and its relationship to schedules and Gantt charts. By the end of the session, you should clearly see how planning artifacts work together as an integrated system for value delivery. Lifecycle tailoring is a deliberate planning decision for optimizing project value. In earlier sessions, we explored lifecycle tailoring as a portfolio and system level strategy decision that is aligned with organizational value delivery. Here, we briefly shift to the project level, where tailoring serves as a planning decision that enables effective governance and supports the delivery of intended outcomes and benefits. Once the life cycle is tailored, during planning it becomes the framework that guides execution. It determines how detailed the plans need to be, how often decisions are revisited, and how value is tracked over time. Effective planning uses life cycle tailoring to protect value by avoiding over-planning in uncertain environments or under-planning in high-risk regulated ones. In this sense, lifecycle tailoring is one of the most important planning decisions a project manager makes. Understanding tailoring this way is important because it reinforces that value optimization does not begin during execution. It begins with intentional planning choices that shape stakeholder expectations, decision cadence, and the project ability to adapt over time. Tailoring shapes how the project will be planned, governed, and measured for value. Lifecycle tailoring at the project level is a planning decision that directly shapes how the project is managed day to day. It influences how detailed the plans need to be, how risk and uncertainty are addressed, and how governance decisions occur, and how progress and value are measured. Importantly, tailoring also establishes expectations for how change will be handled, whether through formal control, frequent review, or adaptive adjustment. In this way, lifecycle tailoring functions as a planning mechanism for value delivery, ensuring the project's management approach fits its context rather than forcing the work to fit a predefined model. These planning implications set the foundation for how execution, monitoring, and value realization will unfold over the life of the project. Project-level tailoring is guided by the characteristics of the product, team, and delivery context. At the project level, lifecycle tailoring is guided by a small set of practical considerations related to the product or its deliverable, the project team, and the organizational context. These factors help the team determine how much rigor is appropriate, how stable the requirements are likely to be, whether the work can benefit from incremental feedback, and how governance and control should be structured. The key point is that tailoring is not arbitrary. It is a planning activity informed by the nature of the work and its environment, ensuring that the project management approach supports value delivery rather than constraining it. These tailoring considerations inform how planning artifacts, governance mechanisms, and execution strategies are defined for the project. Product and deliverable characteristics guide project-level tailoring decisions during planning. Our focus this week is on stakeholder engagement, scope, and procurement. As a result, we will concentrate on product and deliverable characteristics as key inputs to project-level tailoring. Characteristics such as compliance requirements, technology maturity, requirement stability, and the ability to deliver incrementally influence how scope is defined, how stakeholders are engaged, and how procurement or sourcing strategies are selected. By assessing these characteristics during planning, the project team can tailor governance contracts and engagement approaches in ways that support clarity, manage risk, and optimize value delivery. These product and deliverable characteristics also shape who needs to be engaged, when engagement occurs, and how expectations are managed throughout the project. Product and deliverable characteristics inform how stakeholders are engaged. In the previous lecture, we focused on stakeholder identification, determining who has an interest in or an influence over the project. Stakeholder identification, however, is only the starting point. Engagement planning determines how and when those stakeholders are involved. Product and deliverable characteristics help shape these engagement decisions. For example, regulatory or compliance-driven deliverables often require more formal engagement and defined decision points, while projects with evolving requirements or incremental delivery benefit from more frequent feedback and collaboration. Security-sensitive deliverables may limit information access, affecting who participates in reviews and how information is shared. In this way, stakeholder engagement planning is directly informed by the nature of the product, not just by the stakeholder power and interest. The stakeholder engagement planning process defines how stakeholders will be involved to support value delivery. Planning stakeholder engagement focuses on defining how stakeholders will be engaged, not simply identifying who they are. This planning activity draws upon inputs such as the project's objectives, scope, risk, and stakeholder information, along with organizational norms and constraints. Using these inputs, the project team determines the appropriate engagement strategies, how often stakeholders are involved, how decisions are made, how information is shared, and how issues and concerns are escalated. The result is a stakeholder engagement plan that supports effective communication, manages expectations, and enables collaboration throughout the project. From a value perspective, effective engagement planning helps reduce resistance, improve decision quality, and support successful delivery of intended outcomes. Just as stakeholder engagement planning defines how people are involved in the project, procurement or source planning defines how external resources and suppliers are engaged to support value delivery. This is an example of stakeholder engagement strategy at the project level. The primary output of stakeholder engagement planning is not simply a document, but a clear strategy for how stakeholders will be informed, involved, and supported throughout the project. This includes defining communication expectations, decision authority, escalation paths, and roles and responsibilities. These elements help ensure that stakeholders know when and how they are expected to participate, which reduces confusion and conflict during project execution. Stakeholder engagement planning also results in updates to integrated project plans, reinforcing that engagement is not a standalone activity, but a part of the overall project planning framework. Notice that this strategy does not just list stakeholders, it defines how each group will be engaged, how often, and what authority they have. Those decisions are informed by the product characteristics, regulated data, evolving requirements, and phased delivery, which require both formal governance and frequent collaboration. PMBOK 8 separates sourcing strategy from procurement management to emphasize sourcing as a strategic planning decision. In earlier PMBOK editions, sourcing decisions, such as make-or-buy analysis, were treated as outputs of procurement planning. PMBOK 8 separates sourcing strategy to clarify that these are strategic planning decisions, not procurement execution activities. This decision reflects procurement's unique position within organizational structures. Typically, procurement is integrated into or extended from the larger organizational procurement department. Its PMBOK 8 now reflects procurement in Appendix 4. This distinction reinforces that projects should first decide whether and how work will be sourced before determining how suppliers are contracted and managed. Sourcing strategy decisions determine how value will be created and protected through make-or-buy choices, risk allocation, and alignment with organizational strategy. For that reason, PMI places sourcing strategy within the governance performance domain, emphasizing oversight, decision authority, and accountability. Procurement management then focuses on executing those governance decisions through contracting, supplier selection, and relationship management. This distinction reinforces that sourcing is a strategic governance decision, while procurement is an operational execution activity. This visual highlights the governance distinction introduced in PMBOK 8. On the left, sourcing strategy represents strategic value-based planning decisions, determining whether work should be performed internally or externally, and how value and risk are allocated. These decisions belong in the governance performance domain because they require oversight, accountability, and alignment with organizational strategy. On the right, procurement management focuses on execution, contracting, vendor selection, and supplier management, carrying out the sourcing decisions established through governance. Separating these activities reinforces PMI's shift towards intentional planning and value delivery, rather than treating sourcing as a byproduct of procurement. Planned sourcing strategy establishes how project work will be sourced to optimize value and manage risk. In this course, we focus on project planning strategy, so our emphasis on planned sourcing strategy. This planning activity determines whether work should be performed internally or sourced externally, and how risk and responsibility are allocated, and how sourcing decisions align with organizational strategy and value delivery. These are governance level decisions, which is why PMI places sourcing within the governance domain. On the slide, you see the inputs, the project charter, the integrated project plan, project documents, and enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. The project charter is carried over from our initiating process, and the integrated project plan represents the fact that we will be updating project plans, and that in reality, while we're going through this sequentially, all of these planning activities tend to happen concurrently, and one updates the other as we kind of elaborate the plan throughout all the different processes. Project documents include things like quality documents, technical specifications, project requirements, scope information, and things like that. Enterprise and environmental factors are factors in the project's environment that we need to consider in this sourcing strategy. And then organizational process assets, as related to sourcing or procurement, may do with contracts that we've done in the past, project plans we've had in the past, and a number of items such as that. Sourcing strategy decisions are informed by structured evaluation and analysis. This slide focuses on the analytical tools that support sourcing strategy decisions. Make-or-buy evaluations determine whether work should be performed internally or externally, based on value, risk, capability, and strategic control. Source selection analysis does not select the supplier. Instead, it defines how suppliers will be later evaluated, ensuring transparency, consistency, and alignment with project objectives. The purpose of planned sourcing strategy is to establish a clear framework for how project deliverables will be obtained, whether they are produced internally or acquired from external sources. At the planning stage, the focus is not on contracts or vendors, but on determining what should be sourced and how it should be sourced, and when sourcing decisions need to be made to support value delivery. A central component of this process is make-or-buy evaluation, which helps the project team to determine whether work can be performed more effectively using its internal capabilities or should it be outsourced. This decision considers factors such as organizational expertise, cost, innovation requirements, risk exposure, control over deliverables, and time constraints. When internal expertise is strong and strategic control is important, insourcing may offer advantages such as tighter integration and greater oversight. Conversely, outsourcing may be beneficial when external expertise is needed, capacity is constrained, or when transferring delivery risk to a supplier supports organizational objectives. In addition to make-or-buy analysis decisions, the sourcing strategy also defines how external sources will be evaluated through source selection analysis. This involves establishing criteria such as technical capability, past performance, financial stability, compliance requirements, and alignment with organizational values that will later be used during project execution. Importantly, this process differs from procurement execution. Planned strategy is a governance-level planning activity that shapes sourcing decisions and risk allocation. Procurement management then applies these decisions to contracting and vendor management, which is addressed in the project performance domain. The outputs of the planned sourcing strategy establish governance decisions that guide procurement execution. The outputs of the planned sourcing strategy are not contracts or vendors, they are strategic decisions. These outputs define how project work will be sourced, whether the work should be performed internally or externally, and how suppliers will be later evaluated. They also clarify how risk and responsibility are allocated between the organization and external sources. From a governance perspective, these outputs ensure that procurement activities are aligned with organizational strategy, value objectives, and risk tolerance before any execution begins. Procurement management then implements these decisions through contracting and supplier management, which is addressed in the performance domain. Sourcing strategy defines how project work and deliverables will be obtained. Insourcing versus outsourcing decision clarifies where work will be performed and why. Source selection criteria establishes how potential suppliers will later be evaluated. Risk and responsibility allocation identify who owns delivery risk and key obligations. Inputs to procurement execution provides direction for contracts, vendor selection, and supplier management. We see here on the screen an example of a sourcing strategy artifact. You see it has an introduction that explains what the strategy is, and then it gives some benefits to the different strategic approach. So there's cost reduction here. They give an example of what that is, improved quality, an example, and supplier relationships and reduce risk. Each one of these in a scope strategy artifact would be elaborated specifically to that project's context. Clear and proactive scope planning is essential to delivering project outcomes that align with stakeholder value expectations. In this section, we transition to planning the project scope. Scope management is where we define what the project will deliver, and just as importantly, what it won't. This includes gathering stakeholder requirements, defining deliverables, and breaking work down into manageable components. According to PMBOK 8, these processes fall within the planning focus area in the scope performance domain, supporting value delivery by reducing ambiguity and aligning team efforts around a clear scope baseline. What is project scope? It defines the boundaries of a project, what's included and what's excluded in terms of work, deliverables, and outcomes. Why scope matters? Well, scope anchors the project plan and prevents scope creep by aligning deliverables with stakeholder expectations and value goals. Scope planning in PMBOK 8 includes planned scope management, which create a strategy for defining, validating, and controlling scope. Elicit and analyze requirements, which is the collection and prioritization of stakeholder needs. Define scope, which is a process to develop a detailed project and product scope statement. Develop scope structure, which organizes deliverables using a work breakdown structure, or WBS. Scope is part of the planning focus area and contributes to the performance through proactive definition and alignment of project boundaries. Effective scope planning ensures that project work is focused on only what truly delivers stakeholder value. The planned scope management process defines how the project scope will be planned, documented, and managed throughout the project lifecycle. It aims to establish a clear framework for determining what is included and excluded from the project work, helping eliminate unnecessary effort that doesn't add value. This process results in two key outputs: the scope management plan and the requirements management plan. In adaptive project, this planning is more iterative and collaborative than in predictive settings. The process supports value delivery principle by aligning scope with stakeholder expectation and project objectives. On the screen, we see that we have the project charter again, and the project management plan, which again is the set of documents, the planning documents we have for managing a project, and then we have requirements documentation, which is comes in here as an input. Then we have the risk register, the stakeholder register, and enterprise environmental factors, which we've seen before, and organizational process assets. The stakeholder register comes from the initiating project when we did the initiating project. And the risk register is a new one. We haven't talked about the risk management process here, but again, when we're really doing this in real life, we'll have projects that run all these activities kind of run concurrently and be doing it at the same time. Effective scope planning relies on expert judgment and structured data techniques to define and manage project boundaries. These tools and techniques guide how we plan for scope, not just by listing what's needed, but by engaging stakeholders, analyzing needs, and making informed decisions. For adaptive environments, tools like interviews and collaborative workshops are especially vital for iteratively shaping the scope. Expert judgment draws upon experience from subject matter experts to tailor scope processes appropriately for the project. Data gathering techniques and interviews are one-on-one discussions with stakeholders to understand their expectations. Focus groups are sessions with the selected groups to gather diverse perspectives. Questionnaires and surveys are useful for reaching large stakeholder groups efficiently. Data analysis is used to identify trends, validate requirements, and analyze stakeholder needs. Test and inspection planning defines how the project deliverables will be validated against scope and requirements. Other techniques could include decision-making techniques, facilitation, benchmarking, or alternatives analysis. Well-structured outputs guide scope clarity, control, and stakeholder alignment throughout the project lifecycle. This slide focuses on two key outputs generated from the planned scope management process: the scope management plan and the requirements management plan. The scope management plan outlines how the project scope will be defined, validated, and controlled throughout the project. It sets the framework for scope planning, helps prevent scope creep, and ensures alignment with project objectives. The requirements management plan, on the other hand, defines how project requirements will be collected, documented, analyzed, and managed. This includes how changes to requirements will be tracked and approved. It's especially important in complex projects with diverse stakeholder expectations. Both of these documents are foundational in the scope performance domain, supporting clear boundaries and a shared understanding of what is and what is not in scope for the project. Clear, well-analyzed requirements are the foundation of a successful project scope and ensure stakeholder needs are understood and met. The elicit and analyze requirements process is the cornerstone of scope planning. It involves working closely with stakeholders to define and refine their needs, expectations, and constraints, ultimately capturing these as formal project requirements. The goal is to gather and analyze inputs that help identify the what of the project and what the product or service or result should include to meet stakeholder expectations. The output requirements documentation lays the foundation for defining the project scope and guiding solution design and delivery. Key inputs are the project charter. This establishes high-level project vision and initial stakeholder context. The business case. This clarifies the justification and strategic alignment of the project. Project documents such as assumption log, stakeholder register, lessons learned. These give insight into project constraints, prior experiences, and stakeholder needs. Project management plans, especially the requirements management plan and the scope management plan. These define how requirements will be collected, tracked, and managed. Enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets include policies, templates, or tools that shape how requirements are handled. This process directly supports the scope performance domain, ensuring the team builds the right product with the right features, driven by clearly articulated and validated stakeholder input. Effective requirements elicitation relies on a combination of collaborative techniques, analytical methods, and interpersonal skills to uncover, clarify, and prioritize stakeholder needs. This slide highlights a core idea behind the elicit and analyze project requirements process. Requirements are not simply collected, they are discovered, refined, and prioritized through interaction and analysis. First, collaborative techniques are essential. Activities such as interviews, workshops, focus groups, and facilitated sessions allow project teams to actively engage stakeholders. These interactions help surface explicit needs as well as implicit expectations that may not be documented elsewhere. Second, analytical methods help transform raw input into usable requirements. These techniques, such as categorization, modeling, prioritization, and decomposition, enable the team to identify dependencies, resolve conflict, and assess feasibility and value. Analysis ensures requirements are clear, complete, and aligned with project objectives. Finally, interpersonal skills play a critical role. Active listening, facilitation, empathy, and negotiation help build trust, managing different perspectives, and maintain stakeholder engagement through the elicitation process. Without these skills, even well-designed techniques can fail to produce meaningful results. Together, these three elements, collaboration, analysis, and interpersonal capability, work as an integrated system. Effective requirements elicitation depends on not only a single technique, but on how well these components are applied together to clarify and prioritize stakeholder needs. Expert judgment is the application of specialized knowledge, skills, experience, and insight provided by subject matter experts or stakeholders or experienced practitioners to guide elicitation, analysis, clarification, and prioritization of project requirements. Interviews, focus groups, and workshops are interactive, qualitative methods of engaging stakeholders directly. Interviews provide deep insight into individual stakeholder needs. Focus groups bring together diverse perspectives to uncover broader needs or identify conflicts. Workshops facilitate group-based collaboration and decision-making, often used to prioritize and resolve conflicting requirements. Surveys and questionnaires allow for structured, large-scale data gathering, especially valuable when engaging many stakeholders across departments or locations. Brainstorming and prioritization encourages creativity and surface-level exploration of needs, while prioritization techniques such as MOSCO, must have, should have, could have, or would have, or ranking techniques help refine which features or requirements matter most. Data analysis and document analysis techniques involve reviewing historical records, policies, or project artifacts to identify recurring needs, constraints, or lessons learned. Prototyping is an interactive technique that enables stakeholders to visualize and interact with a representation of the final project, promoting early feedback and clarification. Workshop and nominal group techniques are effective when diverse viewpoints need alignment. Workshops prepared with structured group methods like nominal group technique help drive consensus. Together, these tools and techniques ensure that requirements are not only captured, but also validated, prioritized, and aligned with the project scope and strategy. Clear, validated outputs translate stakeholder needs into usable inputs for scope definition and project planning. This slide focuses on the tangible outputs produced by the elicit and analyze requirements process and how they support downstream planning activities. The primary output is requirements documentation. This artifact captures stakeholder needs in a structural, unambiguous format, ensuring that expectations are clearly understood before scope definition begins. Well-documented requirements reduce rework, misinterpretation, and scope creep later in the project. Another key output is requirements traceability. Requirements traceability matrix establish clear links between requirements, business objectives, deliverables, and feature validation activities. This ensures that every requirement adds value and can be tracked throughout the project lifecycle. This process also results in an updated assumptions and constraints documentation. As requirements are clarified, new assumptions may be identified and constraints such as budget, schedule, or regulatory limits become more clearly defined. Capturing these updates supports more realistic planning and risk awareness. Finally, these outputs collectively serve as inputs to scope definition. And without validated and analyzed requirements, defining scope accurately is not possible. This process ensures that scope is based on stakeholder needs rather than incomplete or assumed information. The defined scope process establishes a shared understanding of what value the project will deliver and how success will be measured. The defined scope process focuses on developing a clear description of the project, product, and value expected to be delivered. This description may be detailed or high level depending on the delivery approach. In predictive approaches, Scope is typically defined early and structured using a work breakdown structure, or WBS. In adaptive and hybrid approaches, the scope can be progressively elaborated through a product backlog, allowing flexibility as requirements evolve. A critical aspect of this process is the identification of quality requirements and standards, along with determining how the project will demonstrate that those standards are met. As a result, defined scope directly supports alignment between stakeholder expectations, deliverables, and quality outcomes. A key benefit of this process is ensuring that both stakeholders and the project team share a common understanding of the value the project is intended to deliver, reducing ambiguity, rework, and misalignment later in execution. The inputs to the defined scope process provide the foundational context needed to describe what the project will deliver and how success will be defined. The project charter establishes the project's purpose, high-level objective, and authorization. It ensures that scope definition aligns with the approved business need and strategic intent. The assumption log captures conditions believed to be true and known constraints. Reviewing these assumptions helps ensure that the scope is realistic and that limitations are clearly reflected in deliverables. The project management plan, particularly subsidiary plans such as scope management and quality management plans, provide guidance on how scope will be defined, validated, and controlled. Requirements documentation is a critical input, as it reflects stakeholder needs that were elicited and analyzed earlier. These requirements serve as the primary basis for defining deliverables and boundaries. Enterprise environmental factors such as organizational culture, regulatory requirements, and industry standards can influence how scope is defined and documented. Finally, organizational process assets, including templates, historical project information, and standard policies, support consistency and efficiency in scope definition. Together, these inputs ensure that scope definition is authorized, feasible, aligned with stakeholder expectations, and grounded in organizational context. The defined scope process uses analytical, decision-oriented, and facilitative techniques to translate requirements into clear deliverables and boundaries. The tools and techniques used in this defined scope process help transform approved requirements into a clear and shared understanding of what the project will deliver. Expert judgment is applied to interpret requirements, assess feasibility, and clarify scope boundaries. Subject matter experts and experienced practitioners help ensure that the scope reflects realistic constraints and organizational standards. Decision-making techniques support trade-offs related to scope, quality, time, and cost. These techniques help prioritize deliverables and resolve conflicts when stakeholder expectations differ. Data analysis is used to examine requirements, assumptions, and constraints to ensure alignment with project objectives and value delivery. This may include analyzing feasibility, dependencies, or impact on quality and risk. Decomposition breaks high-level deliverables into smaller, more manageable components. In predictive approaches, this supports the creation of a work breakdown structure, while in adaptive approaches, it informs backlog refinement. Interpersonal and team skills, particularly facilitation, enable productive discussions among stakeholders. Facilitation helps surface differing perspectives, build consensus, and ensure alignment on scope expectations. Finally, product analysis is used to define and refine product features, functions, and acceptance criteria. This ensures that the scope clearly reflects what the product or service must deliver for value. Together, these tools and techniques ensure that scope is well-defined, achievable, and aligned with stakeholder expectations and quality requirements. The defined scope process produces clear, approved artifacts that describe what the project will deliver, how success will be measured, and where boundaries exist. The outputs of the defined scope process translate stakeholder requirements into formal, usable artifacts that guide planning and execution. The primary output is the project scope statement. This document provides a clear description of the project's deliverables, boundaries, assumptions, constraints, and acceptance criteria. It establishes what is included in the project and, just as importantly, what is excluded, helping prevent scope creep and misalignment. The requirements documentation is often updated as part of this process. As scope decisions are made, requirements may be clarified, refined, or prioritized to ensure they align with agreed upon scope and value delivery objectives. In addition, supporting scope artifacts may be produced and refined. These can include product descriptions, deliverable definitions, success measures, and quality expectations. These artifacts help ensure that both the project team and the stakeholders share a common understanding of what done looks like. Together, these outputs serve as authoritative references for downstream planning activities such as creating the work breakdown structure and developing schedules and budgets, validating scope through the project lifecycle. The develop scope structure process focuses on organizing the approved project scope into a structured representation that supports effective planning, tracking, and control. In predictive approaches, this structure is typically represented by the work breakdown structure, WBS. The WBS decomposes the total scope of the work into smaller, manageable components called work packages, making it easier to assign responsibility, estimate effort, and measure progress. For projects with complex or interdependent deliverables, a WBS dictionary may be developed to provide additional detail about each WBS element, such as scope descriptions, milestones, responsible parties, resource requirements, and accepted criteria. In adaptive and agile approaches, the scope structure is reflected in the product backlog, where work is organized into epics, features, and user stories. Although the format differs from a traditional WBS, the intent remains the same, to provide a structured and prioritized view of the work required to deliver value. It's important to note that prior editions of the PMBOK guide, this process was known as Create Work Breakdown Structure. PMBOK 8 uses the term Develop Scope Structure to better reflect its applicability across predictive, adaptive, and hybrid approaches. The key benefit of this process is that it provides a strategic, shared view of the project's scope and value, helping the team remain aligned and focused on a common goal. Inputs to the Develop Scope Structure process provide authoritative information needed to organize scope in structured and meaningful way. The project management plan, particularly the scope management components, provides guidance on how scope should be decomposed, documented, and controlled. Key project documents included the project scope statement, define what deliverables are included in the project, and establish scope boundaries. The requirements documentation ensures that stakeholder needs are accurately reflected as scope elements are structured. Approved changes are also important inputs. As changes are formally accepted, they may affect scope components and must be incorporated into the scope structure to maintain alignment and accuracy. Environmental enterprise factors such as industry standards, organizational culture, or regulatory requirements may influence how scope structure is organized or documented. And finally, organizational process assets, including WBS templates, historical project data, and standard naming conventions, help promote consistency and efficiency when developing the scope structure. Together, these inputs ensure that the resulting scope structure is authorized, complete, and aligned with organizational practices and stakeholder expectations. The Develop Scope Structure process uses collaborative thinking and systematic decomposition to organize the approved scope into manageable components. The tools and techniques used in the Develop Scope Structure process help the project team transform an approved scope into a structured framework that supports planning and execution. Expert judgment plays a key role in determining how deeply the scope should be decomposed and how deliverables should be organized. Experienced practitioners and subject matter experts help ensure that the scope structure is logical, complete, and aligned with organizational standards and past projects. Brainstorming is used to collaboratively identify deliverables, sub-deliverables, and work components. This technique encourages diverse perspectives and helps ensure that the full scope of work is captured, particularly for complex or innovative projects. Decomposition is the core technique of this process. It involves breaking high-level deliverables into smaller, more manageable components. In predictive approaches, this results in work packages within a work breakdown structure. In adaptive approaches, decomposition supports the creation of epics, features, and user stories within the product backlog. Together, these tools and techniques ensure that the scope is structured, understandable, and actionable, providing a foundation for scheduling, cost estimating, resource planning, and scope control. Developed scope structure process produces authoritative scope artifacts that organize work, establish control baselines, and guide value delivery. The outputs of the developed scope structure process provide the formal artifacts that organize project scope, enable effective planning and control. The scope baseline is an approved reference that includes the scope statement, the work breakdown structure, and the work breakdown structure dictionary. It serves as a foundation for monitoring scope, performance, and managing changes throughout the project lifecycle. The work breakdown structure is the primary output in predictive approaches and represents a hierarchical decomposition of the total scope into deliverables and work packages that can be assigned, estimated, and tracked and measured. The WBS ensures that all required work is captured and clearly understood by stakeholders. The WBS dictionary supports the WBS by providing additional detail about each work package. This may include scope descriptions, milestones, responsible parties, resource requirements, and acceptance criteria. The dictionary enhances clarity and accountability, especially for complex projects. In adaptive and agile approaches, the product backlog serves as a similar purpose. It provides a prioritized list of known work items, such as epics and user stories, that represent the evolving scope of the project. While the format differs from traditional WBS, the backlog still offers a structured view of scope and value delivery. Together, these outputs ensure that the project scope is clearly organized, formally approved, and aligned with planning and execution activities. Both the WBS and the product backlog organize scope to deliver value, but they structure and manage work in fundamentally different ways. This slide illustrates how scope structure differs between predictive and adaptive approaches. Even though both aim to organize work and deliver value, on the predictive side, the work breakdown structure decomposes the project into a hierarchical set of deliverables and work packages. Each level represents increasing detail, allowing the team to assign responsibility, estimate cost and durations, and track progress against a stable baseline. Once approved, the WBS typically changes only through formal change control. On the adaptive or agile side, the product backlog serves a similar purpose but uses a very different structure. Instead of a fixed hierarchy, work is organized in a prioritized list of epics or user stories. The backlog evolves over time as new information emerges and priorities shift. Planning occurs incrementally through the backlog refinement and iteration planning. The key takeaway here is that both artifacts represent scope, but the WBS emphasizes predictability, completeness, and control, while the product backlog emphasizes adaptability, prioritization, and continuous value delivery. PMBOK 8 recognizes both as valid scope structures depending on the project's delivery approach. Different structures, same goal, organizing scope to deliver value. This slide shows a couple of different ways to represent a work breakdown structure. On the left is a tabular structure that looks a lot like maybe something you can do with an Excel spreadsheet, while the other is a mind map representation. Both of these are perfectly valid. This would be something you would determine in your scope management plan on which one of these you're going to use to organize your scope, project scope. On this slide, we can see a Gantt chart view that looks a lot like a Microsoft project file. You can see the WBS code and the deliverables. The ones that are highlighted in blue are the work packages, and then underneath them are the individual tasks that are done. But you can see how they kind of fall through like a waterfall. This is a lot where the waterfall terminology comes from for predictive projects. This week, we emphasize that planning is not about producing documents. It's about making intentional decisions that protect and optimize value. Lifecycle tailoring determines how rigor, control, and adaptability are applied. Stakeholder engagement and sourcing strategies shape how people and resources support delivery. Scope planning is supported by well-organized requirements, ensures clarity and alignment. Finally, scope structures such as the WBS and its Gantt chart representation or backlogs translate into approved and actionable, trackable work. Together, these elements form a cohesive planning system that enables successful value delivery. Thanks. And I appreciate everyone for being here. And those of you that viewed this video on YouTube, thank you. And I'll see everybody next week.